Hi, and welcome to this brand new edition of Kenduck's Classroom, where my motto is, don't get fooled again on your next history test. So I am Mr. Kenduck, and what I'm here to do today is to give you some civil rights vocabulary notes for you to take down. And we really can't start talking about the civil rights era in the 1950s and the 1960s until we go back at least 100 years in the United States history and talk about where the civil rights or the need for the civil rights movement came from in the first place. So the story really starts in the 1860s and in the 1870s, where the Civil War has ended. The Civil War, of course, was fought in the beginning to keep the states together, but it ended up being a war about ending slavery. And after slavery's ended, there's actually 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution that are good for you to know. So there's the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which is a law that bans slavery or ends slavery. Then there's the 14th Amendment, which basically says if you are born in the United States of America, you are an American citizen. And there's also a part of the 14th Amendment that's called the Equal Protection Clause that says every citizen in the United States of America is equal under the law and has all the same rights. Then there's the 15th Amendment, which says if you are an American citizen, you are allowed to vote in the United States of America. And so what the problem was in the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s is that African Americans living in many states, but especially the southern states, were still disenfranchised, meaning they were still being deprived of their rights as American citizens. So we really need to talk about this before we talk about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so essentially, African Americans in many of the southern states, they didn't have any political power in the form of not being able to vote. For example, African Americans who might have gone to vote might have been given a literacy test, which is a test to see if you can read. And many African Americans didn't know how to read because they didn't have access to good schools. Moreover, when they or their ancestors were slaves just a few decades earlier, it was actually a law in several states that slaves were not allowed to be taught how to read or write. And so you have a situation in the 1870s, 1880s, and 90s, even though there's no slavery, African Americans are being denied the right to vote because they may not know how to read or read well enough to pass a test in order to go and vote. Besides the literacy tests, oftentimes when people went to go vote, they had to pay what was called a poll tax, which was money, a tax that you had to pay to vote. And so if there were people who weren't wealthy or who needed money for more important things, they might have had the money to pay to vote. And so both the literacy tests and the poll taxes were ways to stop certain groups of people, especially African Americans, from voting in a lot of the southern states. So you basically had local laws, county laws, and state laws that in many ways went against the U.S. Constitution and the spirit of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now, besides being denied political power, a lot of African Americans were subjected to the so-called Jim Crow laws. And what were the Jim Crow laws? These were a group of local, state, maybe county or municipal town laws that said African Americans and Caucasians had to be separated. They could not be together. For example, there might be a black water fountain and a white water fountain. Perhaps African Americans and Caucasians would not be allowed to go to the same schools. And there's actually one case of segregation that's really famous. It's known as a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson, and there was an African-American man named Homer Plessy who was going on a train car, and he bought a first-class ticket, but the first-class train car was reserved for Caucasians, and African Americans weren't allowed to sit here. So when he went to go take a seat, he actually ends up being arrested because he was going against these segregation laws in the state of Louisiana. And what Homer Plessy actually decides to do is he decides to bring his case to the United States Supreme Court to try to get some justice. And his lawyers tried to use the 14th and 15th Amendment of the Constitution to argue that if there's true equality under the law, then African Americans should be allowed to sit with white people in train cars in this particular case. Well, what the Supreme Court actually does in a 7-to-1 vote is they vote that it's actually okay for black people and white people to be segregated in states. And so they actually develop what's called the separate but equal doctrine, which means as long as there's a black train car and a white train car, it is okay for African Americans to be segregated from Caucasians, from white people. And it's the same thing. As long as there's a black water fountain or a black school, then it is okay. It is fine for states to make laws that say white people and black people have to be separate or they have to be segregated. And so this Supreme Court case, Homer Plessy versus Ferguson, excuse me, Homer Plessy versus Ferguson, was in 1896, and this whole idea of separate but equal would not be overturned until Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, when the United States Supreme Court decided that black children and white children can actually be integrated, not segregated, and attend the same schools. So before we even begin to have the discussion of the civil rights movement, which started to take steam in the 1950s and the 1960s and would be made possible because of the Little Rock Nine and the Montgomery bus boycott and the different sit-ins like in Greensboro, and of course in the Civil Rights Act, a lot of the segregation that we just discussed would not be considered legal anymore. But hopefully now you have the basics down, you've got the vocab down, and we can start to take a look at the protesters in the 1950s and 60s that helped to define the civil rights movement. Again, this is Mr. Kenduck from Kenduck's Classroom. Please feel free to subscribe to my video. Please feel free to like my video, dislike my video, and you can contact me by emailing me at mrkenduck@gmail.com. Thanks a lot, and remember, my motto is, don't get fooled again on your next history test. Thanks a lot, and have a nice evening.